Hey everyone, I just want to let you know before we get to this episode's opening remarks, I want to remind you that if you want to get just the conversation itself, no commercial, none of these opening remarks for that matter, and get these episodes before everyone else does, go to patreon.com and learn how you can subscribe to an ad-free podcast feed. We've got a lot of people who are doing so, and they really, really enjoy it. So you can check it out again at patreon.com/behavioral observations, or just go to the show notes for this episode over at behavioralobservations.com to learn more. All right. Having said that, I'm not sure about you, but I did not get a lot of training in the area of self-management and self-monitoring when I was a graduate student. Pretty much everything I've learned about this, I've had to learn through, self-study. If you're in the same boat as I am, then you're in luck. In session 288, I'm joined by Katie Croce and Jamie Salter. And in our conversation, they provided their unique strategies for fostering self-management using the self and match system that they've developed over the last several years. In this episode, we get into how they developed their unique approach to self-management, how they've refined it over time, the relationship between self-monitoring and accountability, research supporting these practices, and lots more. If you want to learn more about this approach to supporting individuals to become more independent, sign up for their mailing list or consider picking up a copy of the Self and Match Manual. If you need some incentive to pick up the manual, Jamie and Katie are offering listeners a discount using the coupon code BOP2024, and that's good throughout the entire 2024-2025 school year. So this is a really fun episode. I've had a chance to meet and hang out with these folks in real life, which is kind of a rarity in this, I guess, in the history of this podcast. And they're really genuine and passionate about what they do. So I hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I did. But before we get to the conversation itself, I want to let you know that we are brought to you by CEUs from Behavioral Observations. That's right. If you want to learn on the go from your favorite podcast guests, go to behavioralobservations.com/get CEUs to learn more. We're also brought to you by the behavioraltoolbox.com, and that's a new education training site that I've developed with my colleagues Anika Costa and Dr. Polly Gavoni. And we have just put out a new course on motivational interviewing. It's getting a lot of great feedback, and we've got 2 other courses there as well that we've had out for a while that we've also gotten good feedback on. So if you want to learn more, go to thebehavioraltoolbox.com. We're also brought to you by Behavior University, and their mission is to provide university-quality professional development for the busy behavior analyst. They have a newly revamped RBT curriculum, a supervisory curriculum, and lots of webinars and on-demand CEUs and all sorts of good stuff like that. And they've also offered podcast listeners a discount. So if you want to learn more, go to behavioruniversity.com/observations. And I guess last but not least, if you are in the Austin area in March, or if you want to check out this conference virtually, go to behaviorlive.com/VBC to learn about this year's Verbal Behavior Conference. You've already heard shows from Drs. Judah Axe and Caio Miguel. There's a lot of great talks in store for participants. And even if you can't make it to Austin, Texas, well, we'll be sad not to see you, but the online experience is really, really high quality. So whether virtually or in person, I hope to see you there. And again, hit the show notes for details. All right, I think that's it for opening remarks. So without any further delay, let's learn about self-management, self-monitoring, the self and match system, and lots more with Katie Croce and Jamie Salter.
Welcome to the Behavioral Observations Podcast, stimulating talk for today's behavior analysts. Now here's your host, Matt Sikoria.
Katie Croce and Jamie Salter, thanks for joining me on the Behavioral Observations Podcast. How are you guys doing today?
We're doing great. How are you?
I'm doing well, and I am excited to have this conversation. The 3 of us met at ABAI a couple of months ago, had a really fun conversation, and at a certain point it occurred to me, hey, we should have this conversation on the podcast, because there's lots of cool stuff that you guys have been about that I think would be helpful to the audience. So we definitely want to get into that and more. And I think the general topic that I want to explore with you guys is this whole area of self-management, which I don't really think is something we've talked a ton about on Behavioral Observations. So I'm excited to get into it. Before we do, however, I'd like to give you guys the opportunity for the audience to get to know you a little bit better. So if each of you could, take a few minutes and talk about how you encountered behavior analysis and kind of what led you to where you are right now, that would be a good place to start.
Great. Absolutely. So I'll go first. I'm Jamie Salter. I'm in San Diego, California. And Katie and I met kind of completely by happenstance about halfway through our journey to finding behavior analysis, which was really great. I was born and raised here in California, and then I decided to go to Pennsylvania for college. And I joke that I kind of wanted to get the furthest possible from San Diego, but still stay in the US. So
the weather was too nice in San Diego. You had to go someplace where it's,
very cold. That's why I'm back in San Diego now. Yes, absolutely, Matt. So I started thinking I wanted to go for psychology. My dad is a clinical psychology and my mom was a teacher when I was young. And I thought this idea of going into psychology was kind of my career path. And then when it came for graduate school, I really looked at coming only back west again, but I ended up staying at Lehigh University for my graduate program as well as my undergrad. And I went in thinking I was going to be a school psychologist under some really incredible mentorship. And then I found behavior analysis. I think it was in my first semester of grad school. And I thought, I'm just going on for school psychology. I love school psychology. And then someone brought up this field that I didn't really know much about. And I fell in love with it. I had worked with children with autism throughout my high school and throughout my college. And so it just kind of made sense that this was my pivot career. So I concurrently ended up going for my BCBA and my school psych degree. And that's kind of what led me down this very unique career path where I'm still in the field, but doing something very different than I initially thought I was going to do. And I met Katie my second year of grad school, third year of grad school.
Yes, I think it was your third year of grad school and my second year of grad school. So I'll tell you a little bit about my journey. So I'm Katie Croce and I am from New Jersey and I live currently in Pennsylvania, right outside of Philadelphia. And my journey started in Philadelphia. I went to school to study psychology and criminal justice because, unlike Jamie, I thought that I was going to work with juvenile delinquents. And so that was really what I thought my career path was going to be until I did an internship. And I always tell people doing an internship can give you so much information about what you like and what you don't like. And so I worked at a juvenile detention center and I learned very quickly that I just did not have thick enough skin to work with that population. I think I would have probably tried to take each of the children home with me to give them a good opportunity to make a change. And I just didn't have the resources to take every kid home that I worked with. So I decided that wasn't going to really be my path, but I still really liked everything that I was learning in criminal justice. So I kept that as my double major as an undergrad. And I was at LaSalle University. And my summer between my junior and senior year of college, I did something that people would think is very strange now. I looked in the classified section of the newspaper.
What?
I know, right? It's like, do people get newspapers anymore? Two, is there a classified section in a newspaper? And there literally was a classified ad that said, psychology and education majors call this number. And I did. And I called, and it was a parent of two children with autism that was starting a home program. And they said, we're looking for people who are excited and energetic and motivated to work with our kids that have autism. And so this was back in 2003. So there really wasn't like a Google or anything like that. And they're like, do you know anything about autism? And this is kind of, I think, before a lot of people really were aware of what autism was. And I remember hearing about it at some point in my undergraduate program, but I really didn't know much. And I was like, oh, of course I know what autism is because I didn't want to not have the opportunity to get the job, right? So I went to their house. I met their child. He cried the whole time that I was there. And they interviewed me. And then I went home and my parents said, how did it go? And I said, I don't think it went well. I don't think that their kid liked me. So I don't think I will be going back. And they called and they said, we'd like you to come back and start working tomorrow. And I said, all right. And that was how I was exposed to behavior analysis. So when I started working with him, he had no vocal language. And by the end of the summer, he started talking. And I was like, oh my gosh, everybody needs to know what this is. Like, how do not more people not know what behavior analysis is? So because I was at LaSalle, right down the road from LaSalle was Temple University. So I got connected with the program at Temple, and I started at Temple's program the day after I graduated my undergraduate degree. And I studied behavior analysis under Phil Heinlein and Saul Axelrod. And that was kind of the beginning of my journey in behavior analysis.
Did Phil treat you guys to the rendition of West Side Story told through the lens of a behavior analyst and a cognitive psychologist?
I vaguely recall something along those lines. I remember being so intimidated by Phil Heinlein when I first met him. I thought, maybe this is not the field that I'm supposed to be in, because he's the smartest man that I have ever encountered.
I don't think I've met him personally, but I saw him speak at the Maryland Association for Behavior Analysis conference back in the late 90s, early aughts. And he stood in front of the entire room and sang I'm not a musical guy, so I don't know what part of West Side Story this comes from, but he changed the characters to where one of the characters was a behaviorist and the other one was a cognitive psychologist, as opposed to was it the Sharks and the Jets or something like that? I can't remember. Again, probably showing my ignorance as it relates to the finer arts, I suppose. And he killed it too. Like his voice is like it was amazing and incredibly brave to do that in front of an entire room, and quite funny as well. So anyway, that's my Phil Heinlein story.
Funny.
I did, however, meet Saul Axelrod. I think I shared a few anecdotes with you guys about that when we met in person. And boy, what a
amazing
just
man.
One of the nicest guys in behavior analysis that you're likely to meet. Humble, self-effacing, yet massive contributions. Hey everyone, real quick, I just want to remind you that if you're looking for CEUs and you want to get them on the go to behavioralobservations.com/get CEUs. We have over 60 events there from some of your favorite podcast guests. There's also discounts available for multiple purchases. In fact, I was just running the numbers, and in the last month, the average discount savings was over $100. So if you need quite a few, well, you're in the right place. You can go to behavioralobservations.com/get CEUs to learn more, or just go to the show notes for this episode. Anyway, so I interrupted you with my story time with Matt. I apologize. So you were at Temple.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So then we had to do an internship as part of our program at Temple, and I ended up being placed in a district right outside of Philadelphia. And lo and behold, the other person who was doing their internship there was Jamie Salter. And so we had the same behavior analyst who was supervising us. And Jamie was getting kind of dual supervision, school psych and behavior analysis. But the behavior analyst who was supervising us was really incredible and paired us together and asked us to support a couple of classrooms. And while we were there, we were both in our separate programs learning about behavior analysis from our respective mentors. And, I think we always go back and we say, even at that point, we saw a lot of adult directed interventions. So there was a lot of, stickers and tokens that were being delivered, but everything was adult directed, meaning that the child wasn't really involved in their behavior change. And so we're learning about self-management, and we're learning about how it increases independence. And we're hearing so much from teachers and parents and, administrators that we need to have our students be more independent, but we kept putting in interventions that were adult dependent, right? And so we thought, why don't we give self-management a try in a classroom?
And Katie, what I love about what you just said is that we both just had this gift of having mentors that were researching self-management before we were born. So in my school psych world, my mentor, one of my biggest mentors was Dr. Saul Axelrod, or not, you had also Dr. Saul Axelrod, Dr. Ed Shapiro. And Dr. Ed Shapiro was researching self-management and self-monitoring in the school psych field from the 70s. And then you had Dr. Saul Axelrod, who was researching self-monitoring and self-management from the 70s. And so having these kind of pillars in our field, researching it, but still seeing that it wasn't coming into the classrooms. We were seeing that there's all this research on this tool and it's an evidence-based practice, but it wasn't being used in the classrooms. And it was kind of amazing how kind of bing, 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 everything kind of started lining up. And I was doing my literature review on self-monitoring to support inclusion of students. You were doing your literature review kind of in the same field. And so that's kind of how this all got started.
Yeah. And I think what's also really cool about it is that the teacher who we first started working with had such great success, or what she thought was great success, that she started to tell the other teachers in the building. And so then we were getting like, Katie and Jamie, can you come help us in this classroom? And Katie and Jamie, can you come help us in this classroom? And then kind of from there, teachers move around, right? And they go to different districts. And so then we get a call from another district, like, can you come and tell us about this procedure that you created and help our students? And then after graduating from Temple, Jamie and I, and graduating from Lehigh, Jamie and I both started working for the same organization in Bucks County, Pennsylvania. And I was in the lower part of the county. Jamie was in the upper part of the county. And so then we started building self and match systems for the clients and students that we were supporting in our respective programs. So it started to spread a little bit. And then Jamie decided to do a really terrible thing and leave me. And so she left and went back to California. And it was a really sad moment in my life, because here I have my partner in crime who I'm working with and building this great intervention with, who's also become one of my best friends. And she just thinks it's way better to go back to California and leave her friend behind. But it all ended up working out okay in the end. I ended up actually moving into the position that Jamie was in the upper part of the county, and I got to continue on interventions that she had put in place. So we have kids that like Jamie had in kinder, first, second, third grade. And then I ended up having them like, fifth through 12th grade. And so we got to see their like journey as they progressed through school and all, the incredible things they were able to do. So it was an okay story at the end. And we're still working on this now.
So I want you to go back to something you said a minute ago, that first teacher you worked with, that first self-management intervention. What, if I know this is probably asking a lot, but do you remember can you provide some details about what the problem you were trying to solve and how you guys went about it?
Not only that, but she remembers, and it was an amazing story. She has retired and she has moved on, because 20 years ago, she was kind of mid-career. So now she's beyond her career. And she popped into one of our meetings recently and said, I will never forget you. I will never forget the difference you made. So 20 years later, we still get to remember the stories and chat with her too. We walked into a class, and there were many students in the classroom that had complicated behavioral needs. And she had a system in place, and in case she's watching, I won't tell too much about it, but it was not the system that we would have put in place. It kind of, you would take things away at different steps, and it made us a little bit nervous. And we said, well, we've both been researching self-monitoring. We've both been researching self-monitoring with accountability components and check-in components. Could we maybe start this with one student? And she said yes to one student. So we kind of looked at what are some of those target behaviors. And Katie, I'll let you paint a picture of kind of, there was a laundry list of behaviors, and we did have to kind of narrow them down.
And what grade are we talking about? I'm sorry. Did you mention that? I apologize if I missed it.
Middle school.
Okay, this is middle school. Okay, great.
It was a middle school. Yeah, it was a middle school in Lower Bucks County.
All right.
And Katie, what were some of the behaviors we were saying? Do you remember them?
So yes, there was this laundry list. And so it was like, throwing things and not following directions and having rude language and taking their shoes off. And we're like, okay, so maybe we should focus on the things that like really are impacting their learning. And then we can focus on maybe taking the shoes off at another point in time. And Jamie and I kind of like tease about this now, because I have no shoes on right now. I often like to be barefoot. And so when we do trainings, this comes up from time to time. Like, how many of you right now have taken your shoes off at least once in the time that we've been together? And a lot of people say they have. And so it's like, that's not really one of those big fish to fry behaviors. It might be annoying. It might be a nuisance. But if it's not impeding their ability to learn, then let's tackle maybe the rude language and the destruction that you might be seeing in your classroom.
So we did. We started it with just this one student, and we kind of narrowed down those fish to fry, as you said it, Katie. And we kind of targeted 2 or 3 areas at first, and really quickly we started to see progress. We were seeing that because he was self-monitoring, because he had an accountability component, because he knew he was accessing reinforcement for engaging in the target behaviors we had identified for him, we were seeing progress. And she kind of said to us, hey, this is going really well with Johnny. Can we look at doing this with other students? So within the course of just a few months, we had transitioned from just using this as a single tool for a student in a self-contained classroom to all of the students in a self-contained classroom. But what we learned rather quickly was we had to individualize it for each student, because if we were targeting those same behaviors that we targeted with Johnny with the other kids in the class, it wouldn't have been effective. And back then we didn't have like a written considerations guide, or what do we need to think through, or what do we talk to, but we were just kind of thinking, okay, what are the questions we need? What are the frequency we need? What are the reinforcements we need? And this is kind of what led us to this early process. And as Katie mentioned, from there, kind of the teacher down the hall said, hey, what is that? And how's that working? And luckily that teacher became such an ally for self-monitoring, and an ally for self-monitoring with accountability components, that she really helped spread that word from a grassroots effort.
Yeah. And I think,
go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh, I was going to say the other thing too is she did have some really good strategies in place. I think it just needed like refining and refocusing a little bit. And so by us coming in and kind of incorporating what she had that was working but needed a little pick me up, introducing self-monitoring to her, it really was able to kind of take off really nice and smoothly.
Okay, we're going to take another quick break here to tell you about Behavior University. They've got all sorts of stuff, as you heard at the beginning of the podcast, from RBT courses to supervisory trainings and things like that. I always like talking about their live webinars. They've got a lot of live webinars, and if you've listened to the show for a while, I always tell you folks, check out their live webinars and sign up for them, because they do sell out. I'm looking at the list of webinars right now, and there's stuff on supervision. There's a bunch of school stuff, OBM and ACT, and lots more. So if you want to learn more about this, go to behavioruniversity.com and just look up the live webinars. And if you want to save on anything you purchase over at Behavior University, just use the promo code podcast. So I'll have the links to BU in the show notes of this episode, so you can check it out there over at behavioralobservations.com. Okay, let's get back to the rest of this conversation. Did you guys have any idea at all that it would grow into what is now known as Self and Match?
No.
Okay.
So that's actually a really cute story. And because we were talking about how amazing Saul Axelrod and Ed Shapiro were, we started carrying around file folders with this. And we were like, this is going somewhere. And we would go to Saul's office together at Temple and sit down with filing folders and be like, this is what we're doing, and this is the results we're seeing. And he kept being like, you're on to something. You're on to something. Keep it going. He's like, you have the research behind you. Just keep it moving. And then I would meet once a year. Dr. Shapiro would come to La Jolla each February, and we'd meet at the same restaurant every year up until he passed away. And same thing each year. I'd be like, look what we're doing. And he'd be like, you're doing a great job. Keep going. And so having these mentors tell us you're on the right track, and then having teachers say this is making a difference, and having students show us it was making a difference, really is what kept us organically growing this for almost 20 years at this point.
Yeah, because we were both working full time and doing our day jobs in addition to kind of keeping the ball rolling with Self and Match. And I remember when we first were like, let's change it from a file folder to a pamphlet or a little booklet. And we would go to Staples, and we're very organized. And we bought like 25 different colors of paper. And we're like at the copy machine at Staples making individual colored copies of different sample forms and putting it all together by hand. And I remember like being at our dining room table and putting each page in order. Like it was such a process. So it's really come a long way. And I don't know, Jane, did you think like that we would ever be here, like talking to people about this when we first started doing this? I think we just felt like our own little world. And now.
And I think that as wild as it sounds, I think it's almost like a silver lining of the pandemic too, right, Katie? Because we were doing this in our nights and our weekends, and it was growing organically, but rather slowly, just because we were both working full time, and it was before Zoom and online messages. So I would be like calling you as I'm driving, and we wouldn't even have a shared screen we were working on. And so
Yeah.
I think the fact, if anything came positive from this experience, it was the fact that we now can zoom into people and to school districts and to organizations throughout the country, and we can talk all the time on different ways to do it. So no, if you asked me 20 years ago whether we would be here, I don't think so. But for me, this is what it's all about. We're helping educators and behaviorists and families and parents and students learn how to self-monitor and self-regulate their behavior. And we're fading out our support and having them self-monitor their behavior. And that's what keeps us going.
Okay. So I want to get into what self and match is, because right now, unless the audience has coming into this podcast with prior knowledge, they might not know. And I want to get into some of the, some of the things that you guys do that makes it unique, certainly. And I had a chance you guys graciously let me sit in on a webinar recently. So I got a little bit of background on the process, which was very informative. So we want to bring the audience along with us. So I want to talk more about self and match specifically momentarily. Prior to doing that though, you referenced the research in the area of self-management. So I think it'd be worthwhile to spend a little bit of time, particularly since this is something that, our general BCBA prep is so individual focused. And not that this isn't individualized, but, by individual focus, I'm talking about like tier 3 interventions, functional, complex functional assessments and individualized plans and things like that. Okay. So, and as such, we don't get, at least I don't think we get a lot of exposure to these sorts of things. So if you can walk us through just maybe some of the basics of self-management, what we know about it from the literature, that would be a good place to move on and talk about what you guys do more specifically.
Yeah, I always say this is the boring part of the discussion that I always tend to take on. So the interesting thing is that the board who, certifies us as behavior analysts, they have all of this content that we have to learn about, right? And one of those areas are behavior change procedures. And over the years, self-management has fallen off of the list. So unfortunately, for the generation of folks who are going through their instructional programs now, they may not get exposed to behavior or to self-management during their behavior analytic programs. And so Jamie and I were just, super fortunate to have not only a time period where it was a part of the content that needed to be covered, but also to have these mentors who were studying self-management. So they pass on that, bug and that excitement to us. And I think that's our job, is to kind of train this next generation on other interventions that are evidence-based that they can use. And so the research on self-management is so vast. Literally, if you wanted to know if you could use self-management to change eating habits or exercising habits or being on task or increasing communication efforts or decreasing challenging behavior, there is research to support using self-management in any of those varieties of ways. So it's super versatile. It can be individualized to support very unique individuals. So if you have learners that are complex and have an intellectual disability, there's research to support self-monitoring with individuals with intellectual disabilities. There's research on self-monitoring to help support preschool children. And I think sometimes that's why people veer away from using self-monitoring, because they think that their clients are either too young or they're too complex. And so they don't even give it a second thought. So our hope is that by kind of sharing a little bit about all of the research that's been done in the past and put it in a kind of really functional way for people to kind of pick up and feel confident that they can implement a really good self-monitoring system from the get-go, that people can start thinking about how to incorporate that into their toolbox and not just a token economy or a contract or something like that. And the other thing that I was going to say is, you mentioned the tiers, right? So self-monitoring is really an intervention that you can use across all of the tiers. It can be used at a tier 1, tier 2, or tier 3. when you consider function and why the behavior is maintained, you can incorporate that into your self-monitoring intervention. So it really can evolve based on whatever the client's need is. Jamie?
Katie, one other thing I think you're so good at talking through also is kind of that there's been these literature reviews or these meta-analyses that have looked at self-monitoring too. Do you want to kind of capitalize on those really quickly?
Sure. Yeah. And so there's 3 big ones that I always point people in the direction of. So one is the National Autism Center's National Standards Project. There's a phase 1 and a phase 2, and they're supposed to be coming out with a phase 3. I think it was supposed to come out this past spring, but I'm sure the pandemic put a little delay on that. And they identify self-monitoring as an evidence-based practice, and they did in phase 1 and in phase 2. So I'm confident in phase 3, it will continue to be an evidence-based practice. Then there was a research synthesis out of the University of South Florida looking at children with challenging behavior. They also found self-management as an evidence-based practice. And then the National Professional Development Standards, they also identify self-monitoring as an evidence-based practice. So there is so much out there, but we just don't get exposed to it in our academic programs as behavior analysts unless you have someone like me or someone like, Jamie, who is really passionate about self-monitoring and has been exposed to self-monitoring themselves. So, I hope it's like our little piece that we're contributing to the field, because if it wasn't for our mentors making us so incredibly knowledgeable about self-management, we also probably wouldn't be doing this work. So, we have to keep passing on these good strategies to that next generation.
Kind of reminds me of hanging out in the same neighborhood as the standard acceleration chart is something that's, fallen off the task list. But
yeah.
Go ahead, Jamie.
I was going to just quickly mention that this has become such like a passion project of ours, talking to the next generation and encouraging them to continue loving self-monitoring as much as we do, that if anyone of your listeners is professor or faculty and they want us to hop in on any of their classes, we love coming to grad classes and just doing like a 20-minute, like, this is what self-monitoring is, so that people can hear from us about it, because we know it's not in all of the coursework these days. And we've also compiled all of the research and put it on our website so that if people want to look and click on all those links of what Katie just went through, they're in one place for them.
Regardless of your title, if you are a behavior consultant who is working in or with schools and you are struggling and wondering why your interventions are not producing the desired results, you are not alone. Unfortunately, those tasked with improving behavior in schools are too often left to carry the burden by themselves. You are the behavior person, so you take care of it, is the unsaid mantra. But you can't improve behavior and the associated outcomes by yourself. In fact, creating sustainable improvement in student behavior almost always requires changes in the performance of the educators. I'm Dr. Pauly, and along with my colleagues Anika Costa and Matt Sikoria, we are designing coursework called the Behavioral Toolbox. In it, you will be taught strategies grounded in organizational behavior management for consulting in schools in a way that brings out the best in educators so they can bring out the best in the students they serve. If this sounds exciting, be sure to click on the link in the description to sign up for more information.
Yeah. Is there a meaningful distinction between the terms self-monitoring and self-management? Are there other terms that are used interchangeably, or are there differences between these? Because just in our conversation thus far, I've heard you guys use a couple of different variations, and I'm curious, are there variations on the same theme, or are there, again, meaningful distinctions between these terms?
Let's do it. I'll tackle it first, and then you correct me if I'm wrong, Katie. I've the way that I learned it in graduate school, I've always seen self-management as like the umbrella phrase, and then underneath self-management, you hear terms like self-monitoring, which is that piece of self-management, and self-recording and self-assessment and self-reflection. So I've kind of seen self-management as that key term, but I've kind of used them interchangeably, and I do know that I do that.
Yeah, it's definitely that umbrella phrase. And then underneath self-monitoring and then kind of self-observation and self-recording kind of encompass self-monitoring.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right. So so you guys get a good idea of that self-monitoring or self-management is a good thing. It's got, applications that are quite diverse, not not just in terms of the level of need, but also across various aspects of life, and certainly got an idea of how you guys came to be aware of these practices. So what is the self and match process that you guys have, I guess, codified into these various resources that you have? What are the basic steps of it?
Yeah, that's a great question, Matt. And I will definitely walk us through those different steps. I would say, as I'm leading into this discussion, I want to be very, very clear that we know we did not invent self-monitoring. We did not invent self-monitoring with an accountability component. What we did was we sifted through all of these years of research, all of this good data out there, and we thought to ourselves, how can we make this more applicable? How can we make this more practical? Because it is on a shelf. It's not being used. It's not the first go-to intervention. And how do we make it more meaningful? So what we did was we took all of that research and we manualized it. We looked at every one of those components that we knew was effective, and then we put it into a user guide so that if people want to start self-monitoring and they don't know where to start, they can certainly look online and look at different research sources, or they can grab this manual and have everything they need. So when you get into self and match, the first thing you look at is the individual's needs. You can't have a one size fits all. You can't have the same form for every student. You really go through this collaborative process of identifying what are the target areas and how are you going to implement this with each individual student or client. From there, when you get to the actual steps of self-monitoring, there's 5 steps, and they're always the same 5 steps. The student or client always answers the question first. Whatever 3 to 5 questions have been set, we always have the student self-answer those questions first. Then a staff member, a teacher, a paraprofessional, an RBT, parent answers the question second. So there's a self-reflection component, and then there's an accountability component, a match component. Once the student has answered all of the questions and the staff member, an adult, has answered all of the questions, we look for matches. We look for yes matches where they both said yes, and we look for no matches where they both said no. And the reason we do that is because we award points for both a yes match and a no match. If a student had said yes, I was respectful, I was cooperative, I was following directions, I was using good personal space, and we agree, they're awarded 2 or more points. And they're awarded 2 or more points because they're awarded 1 point because they engaged in the target behavior we're looking for. And they were awarded 1 point because they honestly self-reflected on their behavior. They took ownership. They saw kind of what it was that they are working on. But if the student says no, and we say no, we still award them 1 point for honest self-reflection. And I think that's what makes this system different than many other systems that are out there, is that we still give partial credit for a student if they say no. So if they say yes, they get 2 or more points. If there's a yes match, if there's a no match, they get 1 point. But if there's a mismatch where the student says yes and we say no, then there's 0 points awarded. Then the only other kind of key component with every self and match system is at some period of time, based on some predetermined criteria, there's some type of reinforcement. But all of those factors are individualized. How often they earn rewards, what their reinforcement is, what the criteria is all individualized based on that specific learner. Yeah. Katie, did I miss anything on that?
No, I think you hit everything. And I think the only other thing that I would add to that is that there's like a reason why that no match is worth 1 point. And we often don't get to talk about that in kind of great detail. But when we first started working in the field, we came into contact with a lot of learners that had an aversion to hearing the word no. When they were told no, they couldn't do something, or no, that wasn't right. And that would really upset them. And so when we first started way, way, way back in the day, that was in our minds. And so we wanted to make sure that we taught learners from a young age, as early as we start working with them, that no is not a bad thing. And if they recognize that they're engaging in a behavior that might not be the expected behavior, it's an opportunity for us to help them change that behavior to something that's more productive. And so we want them to see that no is not a bad thing. No is an opportunity to grow. And as the staff, we're going to be there to support them. And at the same time, when they say, no, I didn't use kind words, and the staff says, you're right, Matt, you didn't use kind words. I agree with you. Thank you so much for being honest in your self-reflection. Even in those moments where we have to provide them with corrective feedback, we can praise them for their honest self-reflection. So building in really that rapport building with our clients, even when we have to give them that kind of corrective feedback.
And Katie, I'm going to jump in one more time and say another reason that we do the no as one point, in addition to the reason you explained, is because we've found that if you just have a system where a yes is worth 1 point and a no is worth 0 points, what do you often see happen? The students give themselves all yeses because they know they're only getting credit if they give themselves yeses. So they're not as accurately self-reflecting. They're just kind of going, yes, 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 yes. Where by saying, you get partial credit if you give yourself a no. If we match and I'm giving you a no too, you're still getting 1 point. You see students take that perspective. You see them stop and think, how did I act and what feedback am I about to get? And it gives them a deeper level of critical thinking in that moment too.
Mm-hmm. So one of the things that when I attended your workshop, the layout of how this looked was very familiar to me because I've been using like check-in, check-out type of point-based reinforcement systems for forever. Mm-hmm. And so it was easy for me to kind of visualize, just tweaking the point sheet to accommodate for the yes and the no. Whereas, ordinarily when I would make a check-in, check-out sheet, and I'm kind of in the same mindset as you guys, I have like templates that I use, but I never have just a blank generic one that I hand out, and I think that's one of the keys or that's one of the areas where people go astray with any of these types of systems is where, they don't personalize and for folks who have no idea what we're talking about like a daily point sheet or point card that a student gets. And I'm talking about this from a school perspective. I know you guys use this all over the place, but so feel free to fill in those blanks for other applications. But, a daily, what it is basically a piece of paper or a card that has all the activities throughout the day in which the student, where we want to intervene on problem behavior or other types of behavior that we want to change. And that there is some sort of rating after this, a sort of encouragement at the beginning of the activity or period or class or what have you. And then there's a rating afterwards. So this process seemed very, very familiar to me. And I actually, after that webinar, I actually changed I got a referral for a student as, I did change it slightly and I had the yes, no, and for student and teacher. And I will say that, this is an N of 1, but, so far it's going very, very well. So
that's awesome. Matt, you said something that I think is really key here. And that is, it sounded familiar. And we get that all the time. Like, oh, I've been doing point sheets, or I've been doing check-in, check-out, or I've been doing different ratings, and gosh, this is similar, just a little bit more systematic. And that's exactly what it is. So if you're listening and you're like, this sounds a lot like what I'm doing, it is. But the difference is, I think what makes us stand up apart is the fact that because it's manualized and because you're getting encouraged to think through every single what if before you set up the system. So the form itself is one piece of it, but then there's things like, what are you going to do if the student refuses to fill it out? What are you going to do if they leave early? Where are you going to put it into the day so you have the data when it's time to go through the data? How are you going to graph this data? What are you going to do if all of these what ifs are required to think through before you start self and match, so that there's not this like, oh, I've been sending the form home every day and I don't actually have them when it's time to look at data and IEP progress or behavioral progress. Or, oh, the student ripped up his form at 9 a.m, so we just didn't use the system the rest of the day. Like all of those what ifs you're thinking through before you set up your very first system. And I think that's one of the key things that makes the intervention different than other similar interventions.
Yeah, you guys have encountered all those problems and have, probably some pretty good answers for them, I suspect.
Yeah. And people are always, they'll ask us, what about this and what about that? And And we, in our considerations guide in our manual, as people ask us those questions and we've not heard them before, we're like, oh, well, this might be really helpful for somebody else to know. So then we can add those kind of planning questions to our considerations guide. But the considerations guide is, I think, like the meat and potatoes of the intervention. And it really could be used for self-and-match or any other intervention that you're using, because it's like a checklist of going down to make sure that you've covered all of the things that we know the research tells us that we need to do when we're setting up effective interventions. And it's geared towards not only behavior analysts, but somebody who's a classroom teacher who has never heard anything about behavior analysis before, or a parent who's never heard about behavior analysis before. We've taken all of that kind of scientific language out, all of that jargon out, and put it in layman's terms so that it's approachable for people. I think that's sometimes a challenge in our field that, like I told you, when I first met Phil Heinlein, I'm like, oh my gosh, like I don't even know the words that are coming out of his mouth. It's so complicated. And we try to translate that language to other, parents and professionals who need our resources and services. And we still sometimes scare them away by the technical language that we use. So Jamie and I really tried to make it user friendly, that, people can basically follow a recipe, but come up with an individualized system for either their, student or client or classroom.
And Katie, going along with that, you also talk about how, because I went through a school psychology program, I was required to take a lot of consultation courses, and this idea that coming in as a consultant and seeking your input, as opposed to saying, here's your self-and-match sheet or here's your self-monitoring sheet. And so when we designed this considerations guide, our intent was, you as a behaviorist, you as a psychologist, you as a practitioner is going to that teacher or that parent or that student and saying, what do we think the answer should be to this? What do we think the answer should be to this? So it's really trying to encourage you to collaboratively, maybe there's an OT that has input, or a speech pathologist that has input, or a general education teacher that has input, and getting all of their input in the intervention development. You're still driving the bus, you're still driving the train, the direction you want it to go, but you're seeking calculated input from your colleagues from other disciplines as well.
Mm-hmm.
Taking classes on consultation is a topic worthy of multiple podcasts, I think, because that's a whole other kettle of fish we can get into for sure. But we'll maybe just put a pin in that one for the time being. But
we had recorded cassettes. We used to have to sit and push play and record at the same time as we listened back to our recordings from all those years.
Oh my gosh, that's funny. Is there a range of learner profiles for whom this intervention, when I say this intervention, I'm just talking about self-management more generally, but just in your implementation of it through self-and-match or maybe through other experiences, what are the requisite skills for, in terms of learner profile that someone can truly benefit from this type of intervention? I have to imagine there's some cutoffs either, on one end or the other, but maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah. So the research in the area of self-monitoring shows that even individuals, like I had mentioned, with autism or intellectual disabilities or preschoolers can learn how to self-monitor, but it has to be done to meet their level, right? And so we might not present a self-monitoring intervention that is very language focused, that has a lot of words on it, to an individual that is a preschooler that has autism and maybe has limited vocal abilities. So we might develop an intervention for them that is very visually based. So in some of our examples that we kind of share in our trainings and ones that we've created over the years for our preschool learners on the spectrum, they might include like simple language, like, was I kind? Something that a preschooler would be able to understand and associate that with a picture. And we also want to think about how often their behaviors are occurring. So that's a really important component for preschoolers. Even typically developing preschoolers, we might not want to go a half an hour having them check in. We might want to check in with them every 10 minutes because their attention span is a little bit, shorter, and they need a little bit more, hand holding at the younger ages. So we might have check-ins with them every 10 minutes or every 15 minutes. And then as kids get a little bit older and they progress, we can, space out the rating opportunities. But similar to individuals with intellectual disabilities, we sometimes have middle or high school students that have an intellectual disability, and we can still create a self-monitoring intervention for those folks. Again, using the accommodations and adaptations that are beneficial to them. So lots of visuals, maybe breaking the components down into smaller, check-in opportunities. So there really isn't because they have autism or because they have an intellectual disability or because they're a preschooler, it's not applicable to them. It really comes down to that personalization and customization for those learners. We actually had somebody conduct research, thank God they never asked us about it, on utilizing self and match with a learner that engaged in vocal stereotypy. And it was so frequent that I think the check-in was every 15 seconds. And I'm like, good God, I never would have thought that would have been a good idea, but they found effectiveness and they were able to go from rating every 15 seconds to every 5 minutes. So think about the amount of instruction that you get done in 15 seconds versus the amount of instruction that now this learner is able to have in 5 minutes. So, but it was very customized to that learner. They had, an extremely well-trained clinician working with him, but they were able to show progress. So I think it really comes down to, one, having gone through that considerations guide and really thought about the individual things for the learners, and two, having the right motivators, right? So that probably that individual who they were doing it with every 15 seconds, they had a good understanding of what the function of behavior was and had the right motivators to help reinforce that behavior on the other side. So those kinds of things I think are less important, but not important. But I think over time, what Jamie and I have seen in kind of a profile of a learner is that individuals who engage in stealing are kind of our candidates that we always say to try to shy away from, because if they're good at stealing, as the staff, we're not going to know about it until after the fact, right? And so if we're checking in with them even once an hour, but we don't realize something is gone until the end of the day, we might have inadvertently then reinforced that behavior because we didn't become aware of it until later. So that's really the one big behavior that we try to kind of shy away from because we don't have a lot of experience and we haven't really found a lot about that in the literature yet.
A tough one. But I want to go back to that vocal stereotypy case study. Were those data published? Because I know I'm going to get emails from people saying, I need to check that out. So
yes. And we can share that with you so then you can share it as well.
All right. So so I will put it in the show notes and just for anyone
listening. But we don't recommend doing 15 seconds. I would say more likely you see check-ins every 15 minutes, every 30 minutes, once a period, twice a day, sometimes once a day. We were glad it was published because I think it challenged us. And I love when people research things that we wouldn't not have thought to research, but we don't recommend that. But yes, we'll send you the article so you can link it.
Yeah, I'd be interested in check that out just for, not that I have, not going to run out and do that personally. I don't have the resources to, as I'm just that sounds like something you'd need a very, very highly specialized setting to do that in. And public school, at least the circles that I travel in is not said setting. But anyway, fascinating. One of the things I was thinking about when you're saying kids that steal, I would imagine, but correct me if I'm wrong, if lying is in the same category too. Sometimes I have a hard time intervening with students who don't tell the truth for the same reasons. You don't find out that they've, told a fib until much further down the road. Yeah. And then it's, depending on the scenario, it's hard to tell what actually happened and so on. Although I guess I'm just thinking out loud, this just occurred to me through this process. You might change their trajectory of truthfulness, I suppose, by reinforcing matching regardless of what their, how their behavior shook out for a particular period of time. So I think that might be a helpful hedge against, being untruthful. So I don't know if that's something that you guys have seen in your practice.
Yeah. Part of my dissertation study, I would say initially the worst part of my study, when I was all the way at the end of my study and analyzed all of my data, one of my dissertation committee members asked if I had looked at the number of matches across all of my participants. And so I had 7 participants And each of them had like 3 or 4 behaviors. And we were checking in with them anywhere between, like 8 and 12 times a day over about 60 school days. And so I was like, of course, I will gladly go back and recalculate all of those individual responses. And it actually ended up being the best data that we pulled out of my dissertation, because what we found was when they were taught what was expected and what wasn't expected, and they were taught how to use self-match, that, the yeses were 2 points and the nos were 1 point. And when they matched, they still got a 1 point for that no match. 96% of the time they matched, whether it was a yes match or a no match. And I was like holding my breath and crossing my fingers for like 70% of the responses. So to find 96% of the time they honestly rated themselves, whether it was a yes or a no match, was just kind of mind blowing. And we can share that data with you too.
And Katie,
Awesome.
with that study, what was also interesting is you had all of the participants fell on the autism spectrum, but you also had some students that were had intellectual disabilities as well. And they were also still matching in the 90s.
Yes. Yeah, it was amazing.
Are there any other research stories these are 2 really interesting ones and very different, I suppose, but if there's another research application, that's published in the literature that you guys can share, by all means do so. If nothing comes to mind, we can certainly move on to other topics. We've got a lot of things to cover. So
I'll give a short answer, and Katie can give a much more thorough answer. But my short answer is we do have all of the research that has been published to date listed on our website. And so if you want to look at all of those different studies, they're there. But our little plea is, we love research. We want people to research this intervention, and we want people that we are not connected with to research this intervention. So if you're listening today and you're like, this is interesting, and there's a world where I could research this, we encourage you to do it and let us know how it goes, or present it at a conference, or bring it to a journal. So, but Katie, tell a little bit more about the synthesis of research you've been looking at these days.
Yeah. So over the past year, a team and I have been looking at all of the research that's been published on self-match and putting together a literature review. So we don't have it published just yet, but I can give you kind of some like preliminary findings, which we shared when we were at ABA. But what was really neat about it is that we found that across all of the articles that we included in our study, about 75% of them included individuals with autism. So hence the plea for more people to do research. And I think like the best form of flattery is when someone does research. Jamie and I don't want to have the secret sauce. We want everybody to be able to benefit from this. So the more people that do the research, the better. And because of that, about 80% of the individuals in all of the studies that we looked at were males. So we need to kind of expand upon that as well. And about 75% of them were children. So definitely feels like it fits what we know about research that, children and autism and males, that seems to hit all of the buckets. But the other interesting thing that we found so far is that across all of the studies, there were 44 different target behaviors that have been addressed using self-match in the literature, which I think, again, just goes to speak to its versatility. And then we kind of categorize them into 4 different categories. So disruptive behaviors, communication behaviors, classroom readiness, and safety were kind of like the 4 categories of behaviors that we've seen so far. So it's pretty exciting to have, people doing that research. And, we're hopeful that by this time next year, we'll have a paper published and, we can share a little bit more information.
And I've noticed that as we go to national conferences or international conferences such as ABA and whatnot, when we first would go, there would be no research on self-monitoring. I would flip through the program and you would not see any. And we're inspired and we're excited to see more and more research, whether it's on self-match or self-monitoring in general, that people are continuing to research. It's always been there. As I mentioned, it's been there since the 70s and before. But I think that it's not a go-to where people are like, this is what I want to research these days. So I think it's great that you were able to synthesize that, Katie, and I can't wait to read it.
Yeah.
What are some common, barriers or challenges that people encounter when they implement this? So let's say there's a listener and they're like, this sounds really cool. I would like to try this with a student in my classroom or something like that. And they go to selfandmatch.com and they get, they either sign up for a training or get some materials or what have you, or maybe both, who knows? And they want to get started. Are what are some ways to make the implementation more versus less successful? Or are there common challenges that you see that people bump into as they go to try this out?
There are, and we list them in our manual because they're so common. And Katie, I'll hit on a couple, but I know I won't hit on all of them. So jump in. I'd say the biggest question we get, or the biggest barrier we hear, is often the buy-in. If you're not the teacher implementing it, if you're a behavior analyst and you want a teacher to implement it, you're like, I have this great form, but the teacher is not doing it consistently, or the teacher doesn't want to do it. And I would say the biggest way to overcome that, and I've alluded to it a little bit earlier, is getting that teacher involved from the start and letting the teacher know that we're not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. We think what they're doing is great and that they have a lot of great tools. We just want to enhance it. So, if you walk into a class and a teacher is like all Disney themed, I've walked into classes, they love Disney, think about how you can incorporate that passion of the teachers on the self-monitoring forms you're creating. Maybe they're earning Disney bucks, and those Disney bucks are then going to a class store that the teacher already has, or maybe the images the kids are circling on their forms are smiling Mickeys or something. So letting the teacher know, like, I know you already have a class store or a marble jar or class rules that you've already set. Like, we're not going to throw those out. We want to weave those in. Really is a huge way to overcome a lot of those initial implementation barriers where there might be some pushback from getting it started from the start. What's another one, Katie?
And I think the other one that we used to hear a lot was like, it's just so complicated to make a form. It's a great idea, but it's just so labor intensive. How do you look so easy when you do it? How do you do that? And so we really tried to take that and make it a little bit easier for folks by providing kind of template forms that people can start with, either in Word documents or spreadsheets, to really help them get started if they're not comfortable using that type of stuff. We have digital forms now that people can use. So I think we've taken that barrier away a little bit. But in the same token, what we find sometimes is that people will say, well, I started using Self and Match, but it's not working. And so we'll say, okay, well, have you gone through a training? Did you use the considerations guide? No. Teacher Matt down the hall gave me the form that he was using in his classroom and it's not working. And we'll say, well, that's probably why. I'm sure in Teacher Matt's classroom, everything is going swimmingly because he's, gone through all the right steps to individualize it for his classroom. But that's something that we really need to do for, your students in your classroom is, really thinking through all of the logistics so that it is customized to meet the needs of the students or clients that are in your environment. So I think that's another big one that we hear from folks.
And Katie, hopping on that one too, you also sometimes hear like implementation concerns that, again, it goes with like any behavior analytic intervention. Things like, oh, I'm forgetting to fill it out, or I didn't fill it out with integrity, or I lost the form. And so that's why we really encourage you to like think through all of those what ifs ahead of time. Like, if you're going to forget to fill it out, how do you set a timer on your own watch or on the student's watch? Or how do you have it on your, at a very systematic time? If you think the student's going to rip the form, like, do you laminate the form, or do you have the form in your hands and then you hand it to the student? So
in my mind, I'm going like, I've done that. That's funny.
Yes. Yeah. And those are all like big considerations, but if you don't think them through, you're going to have barriers, because there are barriers with this type of intervention.
Sure.
As with any.
Yeah. Good stuff. You guys have already shared a couple of interesting stories about examples and case studies and things like that. Is there another kind of like unique example that comes to mind that we can share as we're getting towards the end of our conversation here that we can leave the audience with?
I think what I want to share is that our journey took us somewhere a little different than we initially thought. And I think that was a pretty cool outcome that we didn't anticipate. As Katie just mentioned, we both came up through the autism field and the special ed field, and I went, I have an autism certificate, and that's where I was spending most of my time. So when we first started, using self-monitoring with an accountability component. We were using it in programs for classrooms with kids with autism, and we were using it then for classes of kids with kind of severe emotional behavioral needs. But what's happened over the last 4 or 5 years that was somewhat unanticipated and is continuing to grow is that general education teachers are seeing self-monitoring with an accountability component as an effective tool with general education students. And I think that has been like a huge unanticipated benefit, and such a neat story is that general education teachers are using self-image and self-monitoring as a class-wide tool. And if they have a strong school-wide PBIS language, if they're a school where it's everyone at the school is be there, be ready, be respectful, be responsible, be safe, they're having the students self-reflect on those behaviors, and then they're giving their students feedback on those skills. And I think when I look at how many students in our world these days could really benefit from learning how to self-monitor, could really benefit from getting direct feedback on whether they're meeting school expectations and kind of how to become better, the best version of themselves. It's been a very, very fun, unexpected journey to see how many students in non-special ed settings are using this tool as well.
And it's funny too, because we used to have teachers that would say like, oh, self-monitoring is just for gen ed students. And then we'd have teachers say, oh, self-monitoring is just for special ed students. And we're like, no, we actually all self-monitor. Everyone benefits from self-monitoring. So
one thing I want to ask is, and I promise I'll let you guys go after this, but and I'm keeping you, but this came up briefly in the webinar, and I want to drill down on it a little bit more, is graduating from self-image. The idea with a standard check-in, check-out process, kind of self-monitoring is the last thing you do before you actually wind the program down, So you might start out in a traditional check-in, check-out program where the teacher is doing all the ratings, explaining what the ratings are. And then there's like in this kind of middle tier where, after some period of time, you'd say, okay, well, what do you think you got? This is what I think you got. I think you got a 2 for, this, and then there's some discussion about whether that matches. And there's some self-management. And then, the system goes away because we hope that the individual is contacting the natural reinforcers that are maintaining whatever behaviors we're intervening on in the first place. And you guys said something pretty interesting in the webinar about that, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, so correct me if I'm wrong, but that you tend to continue these interventions even when a student has met their performance goal over some period of time. Do I have that right? And if so, what is the reasoning behind that? Or are there considerations to fading the system out altogether?
Yeah. So yes and yes and yes.
Okay.
But
it's one of my normal 18-part questions, I suppose. Yes. So yeah.
I'll unpack
Need a
it a
whiteboard.
little, and then Katie, I'll have you unpack it even further. So Matt, we feel like our ultimate goal is to have students become independent. And we feel that if you can have students become independent, it leads to a better quality of life. And that's what it's all about for us. And we know it's what it's all about for you and your listeners. And so for us, we feel very fortunate that self-monitoring is a generalization procedure, because when you learn how to self-monitor your own behaviors, you're always with yourself. And so our goal is to fade this intervention as much as humanly possible. So if you start a student at 15 seconds, like Katie talked about earlier, you should go to 5 minutes, for 30 minutes, to an hour, to once a day, to twice a day. If you have a student that's accessing reinforcement after each rating, you're fading that to accessing reinforcement at once a day or once a week. We never want this tool to be more intrusive than it needs to be. We never want our students to need to implement self-image or self-monitoring systems more frequently than they need to. We don't ever fade out the match component. We do feel that you should always, as long as you're using self-image, there should always be an accountability partner. And I'll let Katie explain a little bit about why. But we do believe in thinning and fading and making data-based decisions. And I know we didn't get to talk a lot about data today, but what I will tell you is that there is so much data built into this intervention and so many ways that you can make decisions on the next step based on that data. And so if your data is showing that the student is being successful at 80%, you should be looking at ways to thin and fade it. Katie, do you want to touch on that a little bit more?
Yeah. So, part of becoming a functioning, productive human is that many of us work in jobs where we have bosses, right? And there is a goal for our organization to do something in the work that we're doing. And so if you work for a good organization that has a good leadership program, your supervisor or your boss should be checking in with you, maybe once a week or maybe once every other week, just to say, how is it going? Do you need anything from me? You're doing a great job doing X, Y, or Z. And so as much as possible, if we can get to the point where we're fading the check-ins with our individuals to be as infrequent as possible, but almost on a natural schedule, even if they're checking in with somebody once a week or once every other week, that's pretty much what we do with our own bosses and our own supervisors. We have some type of an accountability partner who's checking in with us to make sure that we're staying on the right track and we're meeting our goals. And so that's kind of our goal for our individuals as well. If we can get them to that point, great. Some of us work with really complex individuals and we won't get to the point where they're only a once a week check-in or a once every other week check-in. But as thin as possible to still have the learner be successful is kind of always the end goal. And as Jamie said, using the data. And in our considerations guide, the last section of the considerations guide is thinking about fading. And so even before you start implementing the intervention, we ask you questions about what's the next step to fade the intervention. As Jamie mentioned, fading the check-ins or fading the, access to reinforcement, so that it can be almost, as natural as possible for your individuals. Yeah.
Got it. That's helpful. Thank you for that. I almost forgot to ask that question, but I recall that topic with interest in the webinar. So speaking of webinars or trainings and things like that, if people want to learn more about what you guys do, how you do it, et cetera, how best can they find out that information?
It's all online. It's all on our website. So we have information about webinars we're doing, in-person trainings we're doing. We will come talk, like we said, to your university if you have that type of setting, but everything is on our website, which is very creative, www.selfandmatch.com. And that's also where you can get the manual if you are looking for a copy. But that being said, we want you to know that there's so many self-monitoring resources out there beyond Self-A-Match. So if you are excited and inspired from today and you aren't ready to dive into the Self-A-Match journey, interventioncentral.org has some free self-monitoring tools. You can find other self-monitoring tools in other places online too. So just want to make sure that's there.
Yeah, Intervention Central is a great resource for sure.
Oh my gosh, it's one of our favorites, not just for self-monitoring, but just kind of all academic and behavior resources.
Oh, yeah.
They have so many great tools there.
I can't tell you how many times I've shared the link on, whole group responding and the good behavior game with teachers. So whoever put that site together deserves heaps of praise. So
a future guest on your show.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah. So, all right. Very good. This has been a ton of fun. Really enjoyed the conversation. I want to give you guys the last word here. So if you maybe could take us out with some advice for the newly minted BCBA, I think that would be a fantastic way to wrap up this conversation.
Mm-hmm. Sure. I'll take us out and Katie, you'll lead us the rest of the way. My advice is kind of twofold. One is don't be afraid to kind of let your direction take you where it takes you. I went to school thinking I was going to be a school psychologist, behavior analyst, work in the schools the whole time. And here I am developing an intervention and sharing it out. So, if life takes you on these different journeys and paths, kind of follow them and see where they go. And the second piece of that is don't be afraid to seek a mentor when at any point throughout your career. And it's not just something when you're new and you're green, but something that having a mentor throughout your entire process is huge. And I recently saw Dr. Shane Spiker speak, and he talked about how green our field is and how new as behaviorists we are. And just knowing that if you are a new behaviorist, it's even more important to have other people you can lean on, because it is a field where we can sometimes feel like we're on an island.
Yeah. And I love that, concept, Jamie, of the mentor, because even 20-ish years being in the field, we still reach out to our mentors. I don't hesitate to pick up the phone and call Saul and ask him a question. Like, I have no shame in saying, I have never worked with this type of behavior in this population, in this environment before. I'm not the expert in everything. I'm definitely an expert in self-monitoring, but I might not be an expert if a child is having, feeding issues or something along those lines. And we shouldn't have any shame or fear that someone's going to think that we're less as a behavior analyst because we're not well versed in every aspect of behavior analysis. There is so much out there in behavior analysis, and we can only know what we have experienced, what we've been supervised in, and your preparation as, behavior analyst candidates is just the beginning, right? Like, take advantage of any continuing education that you can get your hands on. Go to conferences. I think I tell my students in my spare time, I'm faculty at Holy Family University, and I tell my students all the time, go to conferences. You will leave conferences feeling like you can change the world and hear from other people. If you're reading articles in your classes, if you're reading, articles to just kind of stay fresh in what's going on in the world of behavior analysis, go see those people live, because it will make it so much more exciting for you when you can put their voice to what they have written and see them talk passionately about their different practices. It's my favorite part of being a behavior analyst, is going to conferences and hearing people talk so passionately about their work. And it makes you feel like you can do it too. I remember hearing Brian Iwata for the first time and being like, of course I can do a functional analysis in a school setting. It will be so easy, right? And it inspired me to try to do it. So I think that's kind of my advice for newly minted BCBAs. Don't be afraid to say you don't know. Don't be afraid to ask for help. Find someone who you can, reach out to and be a mentor. And eventually that person will reach back out to you and ask for help at some point in time. And I think that's how we make the field grow and be stronger.
And listen to all of Matt's podcasts.
The most important piece of advice. No, just kidding. All right, guys. Thanks for ending on such an inspirational note. This has been a lot of fun. Selfandmatch.com is where you can learn more about what you guys have to offer. And I'll have links to it in the show notes as well. So just go to behavioralobservations.com and sign up for the email list while you're there. That way you get the show notes delivered directly to your inbox. All right, guys. Thanks so much for joining me. We'll have to continue this conversation maybe at the next conference. So hopefully
we'll be at ABA. Have you booked yet?
That's going to be a game time decision. So.
Oh, I hear you.
Thank you for listening to the Behavioral Observations podcast with Matt Sikoria. You can find Matt's notes on this episode at www.behavioralobservations.com. We also invite you to stay connected with us on Facebook at facebook.com/behavioral observations and on Twitter at Behavior Podcast.